This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien kickstarts today's show as he discusses low prices, strong exports, and geopolitical uncertainty. Romulo Lollato, K-State wheat production specialist, keeps the show moving as he provides an update on the Kansas wheat crop. He mentions how the growing season has gone, disease concerns, and harvest expectations. Ending the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with this week's weather update as he mentions the recent rain and if it will continue. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market outlook from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Dan, what level are we seeing for futures prices right now?
Well, there is the overall perspective of the markets that's generally pretty pessimistic on prices. And I don't think anybody following ag markets right now is surprised by that. That's what we've been seeing for about the last month. Corn yesterday, July corn, closed at 439.5. The D's contract actually has showed some recovery up to 448 and a quarter, back to around the $5 area. And had dropped to about 430 or so on that D's contract. So, in fact, it's kind of interesting to look what's happened in the futures complex in the last day or so, that the upfront contract's still pretty weak, but the later contract's actually moving up some. And I'm not sure exactly the combination of either production issues or geopolitical worries that's causing that to happen, but we have seen that occur. And as you talk about corn in particular, again, that 439.5 close here yesterday, when you compare historically where we've been in the short run, we've been as low latter part of 2024 around harvest or so. We got down to about 385. Here this spring, about to 518. So we're almost in the middle of that range. If we had sharp weather concerns in the U.S. right now, we'd probably be closer to 5 at this point, but we've had moisture. People aren't really worried at this point about that. I would say for corn that combination of low prices and a little bit of a weaker U.S. dollar have encouraged U.S. corn exports and aren't doing anything to discourage corn usage in ethanol. So we've had some pretty good usage. The corn export number for the week ending May 29th was basically 65 million bushels. And so in essence, we're basically, with 39 out of 52 weeks done in the marketing year, we're 75% of the way through. We're about 75.5% of the way to meeting the USDA's projection. So that's great news. A lot of times we trail those in the actual shipments market. And we've got bought ahead almost 99% of the USDA's projection, 2.6 billion bushels. And that's, again, 99% of the way to meeting the USDA's goal of 2.6 billion, which is a strong export year. And again, we're only 75% of the way through the marketing year. So strong, positive news in the corn market in terms of actual usage. And again, moisture coming has kind of allayed any fears right now of crop issues. If those problems come, they're out in front of us and in the latter part of June, July, and August, but they're not here yet. So you kind of have what you have there. And then in the wheat market, we've had really weak prices, but strong exports of late also. So here we've had the close in the wheat market, on July hard red winter wheats and on that contract yesterday at 542.5. That 542.5 is above where we were about a month ago. We got down to as low as $5. We here within the last 4 or 5 months, we had been at about 642 for a high. So 542 is better than where we had been. The times when we have really seen lower wheat prices in the last 5-10 years, we got down to about 395, 380 thereabouts. So we've got a little bit better situation than that. But still, in terms of the futures markets heading into harvest, we're sitting at sort of a moderate to lower than hoped for price. I would say that with the lower prices that we've seen, about the strongest wheat export week we've seen for a while, just under 20 million bushels, about 19.8 And for a lot of weeks, Shelby, as you and I would be sitting here talking about this, we'd be looking at 8, 9, 10 million bushels. Well, suddenly, about the last 3 weeks in a row, we're really moving wheat. In the U.S. overall, here for hard red, about 5.4 million. We were at 7.5 last week, I believe, or over 7. And again, a lot of weeks during this marketing year, we were struggling to get to 1 or 2 or 3 million bushels. Well, now we've got this great guns situation going on. And you can ask, well, what is that? Well, yeah, it's lower prices in the U.S. are helping to spur demand, so that's good. And the value of the dollar is at issue. But also you got the reemergence of worries in the world market about world wheat market about the geopolitical conflict in Ukraine and Russia. And I would say when you look at the drought maps in that part of the world, it looks pretty dry for especially Russia, but also Ukraine has issues. So I haven't heard of grain shipments being disrupted yet, as we look for market news. But still, you've got those worries re-engaging, coming back into the market, and may not be so much of an issue right during the depth of our harvest. We'll have, pretty massive oversupply in the short term. But I would wonder how we come out of harvest when what's going to be sold is going to move into the market, and what's hasn't been sold is kept back to see what type of a trend what type of market trend there might be, what reward to storage there might be coming in. So you got that happening in the wheat market, and then soybeans. Really, the soybean market has hung right around 10.25, 10.50 for a good long time for the futures. For the July contract closed at 10.51 3/4 yesterday. November contract 10.33 1/4, and really no carry showing up in that market. I should say there's still 6 to 7 cents per bushel per month carry in the wheat market for hard red winter wheat going on down the road. So whereas the hard red winter wheat market's definitely encouraging people to store at these prices. For the soybean market, not so much, really almost no carry at all till you get way past the first of the year. So anyway, you got that, and soybean prices as they're standing right now at 10.51 3/4, or where they were on yesterday's close. You're looking at an area that is above where we've tended to be when we've been on the lower end of prices over the last 10 years. When we've gotten into a tougher situation, it's been more like 776 for lows, 791, 844. But here in the last several years, we haven't seen anything below 950, But over the last decade, we've certainly been lower. Within the last several months, we got down to 955 as a low, about 1079 as a high, and we're at about 1051 3/4 right now. The soybean market's held back by strong production in South America, and that's affected the pace of exports. We were running pretty strong for soybean exports until the Brazilian crop in particular started to come in, and now we need about 16 million bushels per week to meet the USDA's projection for the marketing year. And here we've been running at about 10, 11, 12, 15, something like that. So actually have fallen behind pace to meet the USDA's forecast, 1.85 billion. So we'll see, and even those numbers projected forward in soybean market are a source of some controversy for some people. So I guess wondering if, as you go into the next marketing year, when we're shooting for soybeans at, again, 1.8 billion bushels plus, whether we're going to be able to attain that or not. But I guess I would counsel people that the USDA, when they put out these export numbers, they've tended to be pretty optimistic year after year after year. So I don't think there's any untoward approach that the USDA is using in making their projections for exports for the next marketing year. They tend to expect, as a practice, normal production, low prices, and higher usage.
You've made a mention of geopolitical uncertainty and concerns a little bit in this interview. Can you explain to us a bit more about what you're seeing on that front?
At this time, we've got two centers of concern, one being the U.S.-China trade issues that are going on, and the other, of course, as we'd mentioned, the Ukraine-Russia war. And here, so far, not a lot of impact on grain shipments coming out of that part of the world, but we shall see. And with regard to China, yes, we've talked about tariffs, and they have their own internal political issues going on right now from what we read in the legitimate press with regard to that. So that's something to to watch with regard to leadership over there. But in the midst of all that turmoil, tariffs on the one hand, political change possible on the other, a big drought has hit in Chinese wheat production areas. China hasn't been a big buyer of U.S. wheat here of late, and it's a lot of that. Some of that's political tariffs and whatever you want to talk about. But if China finds themselves having to aggressively come onto the world market from anywhere to buy, then it starts to crowd out other people that would be going to, the other major wheat exporting countries of the world. China goes into those countries and starts bidding top dollar because, hey, we're tight, and in terms of their domestic supplies, then it forces other buyers who can't compete with what China's going to do to come start buying from the U.S. So, that could be part of what's going on in the world wheat markets, is that China's responding to what they have and other buyers having to compete with that sharp demand from China and then coming to the U.S. As a second resort. We have been talking of late about how the U.S. has tended to be, especially when we had a higher dollar, the kind of supplier of last resort. And part of that's because, hey, we can store these crops and keep them in condition, and we can finance that. And other countries, when they produce something, they just send it. So we've tended to hold granaries together. Well, now you've got a situation where, gosh, these other suppliers around the world, other users around the world are looking for supplies, and I guess here we've got it. So maybe this is the time we always think will eventually happen when the buyers of the world do need to come and find supplies wherever they can, and that would be us at a time like this.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show with a wheat crop update from K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. It's great to be here as usual.
Romulo, how is this year's wheat crop looking?
So, Shelby, this year the wheat crop has been exposed to quite a lot, really, right? If we think back on how things started and how things are going, back in the fall during our prime planting time, it was super dry, and traveling around and seeing the wheat crop in detail now, in some parts of the state, you can tell that, right? For example, far northwest Kansas, we get into some fields that have pretty scattered emergence, or I should say very different maturities in the same field, right? And that's partially because part of the field came up when it was planted, part of the field was waiting to come up whenever rainfalls occurred there, right? Kind of the same thing in south central Kansas. Seems like they planted it out and it was dry, it took some time, and then when it came early November there, we had a lot of rain, really. Parts of the state got anywhere from 3 up to 7 or 8 inches. And that south central part of the state, it got up to 8 inches or so. And we're seeing even some water logging back in the fall that you can see in the stands right now. But all in all, the fall was pretty decent for the crop. Even though it was dry in October, November rained across the state. The fall had warmer than average temperatures, and that helped for the crop to emerge and to tiller out. And so we were going into the winter with a fairly decent crop. In fact, compared to past few seasons or so, this has probably been the best season that we were going into the winter. Then the winter came around. We had a couple of large snowfalls, but otherwise a pretty dry winter, right? So it was a mild winter in terms of temperatures. We didn't get too cold. And whenever we got super cold, there was snowfall to protect the crop. So no concerns out there with winter kill or anything along those lines. Then as we were coming out of the winter, it was dry. It was super dry. And the crop, that's part of the growing season when the crop needs the most water, right? It starts growing and elongating the stem. And so it came mid to late April. There was a lot of wheat crops out there that were showing symptoms of drought stress. Bottom leaves were giving up. Some of the later tillers were also giving up. And we were seeing that kind of like across the state. Now, since then, conditions have been pretty cool and moist since that Easter weekend or around those lines. We have had quite a bit of rainfall across the entire state, and temperatures have predominantly been pretty mild as well, with a couple of days exception here last weekend that we got to the 90s or so. But other than that, it has been a fairly mild and moist end of the growing season for the crop. This really helps the crop, especially if we think what all is going on in the crop at this point in time. So think a few weeks back here when the crop was going through flowering. At that point in time, the crop has already taken up probably 80+% of the nitrogen that it's going to need in season. And that nitrogen that is already in the canopy, what it's going to do is going to be remobilized to the grain to form protein. And that happens fairly early in the grain filling process here. Within 15, 20 days from the beginning of the grain fill, most of that protein is already packed in the grain. So that's one component of the grain, is protein. The other big component of the grain, reminding here that protein is about 10, 12%. The other component of the grain, which is the bulk of the grain, maybe 70, 75%, is starch. Now, that's a very different process from protein. Protein is, again, accumulated in the canopy by antithesis and then translocated to the grain primarily early in the grain filling process. Whereas the starch, which is going to give us grain yield, it's a process that is made on the go. Plants get CO2 from the air and they use sunlight to break that down into sugars. And then those sugars, they go and they accumulate in the grain as starch. So it is a process that is being made on the go. So any conditions that prolong that process, we will actually return higher grain yields. And here we're thinking about cooler temperatures, right? Because then the crop is not as stressed out and it's going to have a longer grain filling period. We're also thinking about higher moisture. So kind of conditions that we had this year. Higher moisture and cooler temperatures during grain fill, they're very helpful for the crop because now the crop has simply more time to, again, on the go produce those sugars using CO2 and sunlight from the air and turn those into starch back in the grain. And that's really increases our grain yield. So really that's why we have a lot of these, they're called yield and protein trade-off, right? In higher yielding seasons, we have lower protein. Well, it's simply a math problem where the crop was able to put back up more starch in the grain, and so it dilutes that protein. And the other way around is usually what happens most season in Kansas, which is actually, it comes to mid-May and it turns hot and dry, and now the protein is already packed in the grain. The starch is yet to be packed, and so that really cuts down our starch accumulation. Yields are lower, protein is higher, right? So again, this year, I think we're heading to probably above average yields statewide, right? Because of these cool grain filling conditions, cool and moist. Whether we're going to see low protein or not, that's yet to be determined, right? Usually we would with these higher yields. Now, another thing that impacts protein content in the grain is how much nitrogen we had in that season. And thinking back, in all the soil samples that our group retrieved in the fall, there was a lot of high carryover of nitrogen out there because probably growers put out more nitrogen than their summer crop removed. And so there's quite a bit of carryover out there. So we might be off to a season where we might have decent grain yields and decent grain protein concentration as well.
Are there any diseases that are impacting the wheat crop right now?
Yes, absolutely. And primarily across the entire state. What happened, remember, I was mentioning about the crop conditions, right? When April came around, it was hot and dry. And at that point in time, we started seeing an explosion of wheat streak mosaic virus. So really a lot of wheat streak mosaic virus happening out there. We were getting calls left and right from growers and consultants out there. The disease diagnostic lab in the plant pathology department, they're getting also bombarded, right, with a much higher than usual volume of samples being submitted. So yes, that has been the primary problem disease-wise in terms of Kansas wheat crop this year. And probably a few things that happened there that helped wheat streak mosaic virus to be so prevalent this year really include, I mentioned early on, that warm fall, right? The wheat streak mosaic virus, it is transmitted by wheat curl mites. And those wheat curl mites, those very tiny creatures that we can't really see with our naked eyes, they love hot, warm, and dry conditions, right? So that fall, conditions that we have back in the fall really helped probably those mite populations to stay up all the way until sometime in December, right? And so probably what we started seeing in April there was still a fall infection where those mites transmitted the wheat streak mosaic virus to those wheat plants, right? And in terms of how serious it is this year, I think that pretty much every single wheat field that I walked in this season has had some level of wheat streak, right? So incidence is through the roof. Severity is very variable, right, in terms of how bad the symptoms are. And so we've seen fields that are simply going to be terminated because they probably have a 5-bushel potential or something, and insurance is going to be called on those. We've also seen fields where there's some symptoms in the flag leaves and, some yellowing and streaking of those leaves, but the field still went out and headed through it and still has a decent yield potential. So there's kind of everything out there. It's kind of hard to tell exactly what's going to be the magnitude of the production decrease in Kansas because of that disease, but it is super prevalent, right? And very briefly here, right, that disease actually is a complex of viruses. We have the wheat streak mosaic virus, the triticum mosaic virus, and the high plains wheat virus as well. Those three viruses, they might be alone or they might be together in the same infection, right? And many of the samples that we are receiving in our lab, they are predominantly wheat streak mosaic, but there's also a very high instance of triticum mosaic virus. And the challenge there is that there is genetic resistance for the wheat streak mosaic virus. It's called WSM2 gene. Some varieties have that genetic resistance. But again, if triticum mosaic is carried along, well, then that's what's going to show up, right? The symptoms might still be there, and we might not be able, there's nothing that is bulletproof out there. There's also other types of genetic resistance. For example, CMC4, that's a gene that provides some resistance to the wheat kernel mite itself, the vector of that disease, and essentially it slows down the progression of that disease in a given field. But again, if the mites are there, we're still going to see symptoms, right? So it's really nothing that is bulletproof, and we're definitely seeing this year. There's a huge variety to variety difference. We're seeing that. Some varieties are looking like $1 million next to a neighboring variety that is very susceptible. And years like these show us that we should be avoiding varieties that are extremely susceptible. Some varieties out there, they show some background resistance that we don't know exactly what it is, but they seem to handle the virus better, right? So if you're choosing between two varieties and one is super susceptible, the other one has some level of background resistance, right? That's probably would be my choice, is the second one with some level of background resistance. And we're discussing that in all the wheat plot tours across the state. So there's still a couple of opportunities there coming up. If growers want to join us, there's some plot tours going on in Tribune today on Friday, right? So that might be kind of on the late end. If you still want to join, there's still time, but you need to hurry. Next Thursday as well, June 12th, there will be one wheat field day where we're going to actually go into really much into detail with Kelsey Anderson-Onofre, our plant pathologist, and Alan Freeds, our wheat breeder. So that one's going to be in Belleville at our experiment field, just west of Belleville, about a mile, and starts at 9 a.m. And then we have one more plot going on in the Decatur County that is going to be on the evening of that June 12th. So there's still a couple of opportunities there to join us, but it is getting to an end, and we're about to get into wheat harvest season now.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. I will put information about those upcoming wheat plot tours in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, as we look at this past week, did all of Kansas or parts of Kansas see some precipitation?
Well, most of Kansas saw precipitation. There's a couple areas that unfortunately missed out on the heaviest, which could probably be a good thing when you look at the locations that did have the heaviest. But the driest locations in the state were the southwest around the Garden City area to Dodge City, and then north and eastward into north central Kansas, where a lot of areas around like Hoxie over eastward to Washington missed out on a lot of that moisture. But where they did get rain, probably the bigger story at this point. A lot of rainfall fell this week. And from the Wichita area north and east to Kansas City to the Flint Hills, got in excess of 6 to almost 7 inches of rain through the course of the week. And a lot of that rain fell, unfortunately, in a very short amount of time. We're talking 24, 36 hours. And it was associated with heavy to severe thunderstorms. That's heavy rain, and that's not good rain. It unfortunately resulted in a lot of flooding. There were some water rescues that were made, and I know there's several rivers that are near historical crests of record flooding in the past just because of all this moisture. And it's running off it. When it comes down that hard, it just can't soak into that ground. And we also had a lot of cool weather and humid and wet weather. And so soils are very saturated in that region, especially most of southeast Kansas. And so any rainfall that we get on top of that just runs off and doesn't get soaked into the ground, unfortunately.
Did we at least see some drought improvements in parts of the state then?
Yes, we have seen drought improvements across the state. Keep in mind the heaviest rain from this event fell actually on Tuesday afternoon. So the cutoff's Tuesday morning for the drought monitor, but the areas that received that rainfall, honestly, they're not considered in drought anymore. They had drought improvements already this week, and we removed D0 from a pretty good chunk of the state. In fact, we decreased coverage in D0 or worse drought by almost 15%, with only 1% of the state in moderate drought. And that's up in the northwest, in Decatur and Norton County. And the worst drought conditions are there, obviously, and then a moderate drought that extends eastward pretty much along the Nebraska border all the way to Missouri. So we still have some drought conditions, still have abnormally dry conditions covering about 50% of the state. But drought improvements did happen and are likely to continue into next week with the precipitation we've already received up to Friday.
What else can we expect in the forecast?
So the overall pattern is kind of undergoing a change, which it always is. It's weather. It changes all the time. We had a tropical storm in the East Pacific that got wrapped up into the storm system, and it resulted in a lot of that heavy rain. And now that frontal boundary is shifted south and is going to sit just to the south of right on the Kansas-Oklahoma border, and eventually shift south into the weekend from there. So that's going to take the primary focus of precipitation along that stationary boundary to the south of Kansas. Not saying that we won't see some precipitation in Kansas. It looks like southern Kansas along the Oklahoma border is going to have the best opportunity for moisture over the coming week. I think I will see precipitation this week. However, the heaviest amounts will be south of the state, where we could see up to another 2 to 3 inches along the border. But as you get north, those precipitation totals are going to taper off pretty quickly. But maybe a quarter to a half inch of rainfall. And when we look at the forecast, it looks scarier than it really is, the chance of storms every day. And really look at those afternoon high temperatures. We've been really cool over the last week, and we're going to start seeing the temperatures creep up as we have less thunderstorm activity and more sunshine. We're going to see to average and even above average by the end of next week. And so that's going to feel pretty warm when we have the humidity around and with the residual soil moisture, and we combine that, we get higher heat indices, we get average temperatures. So it's going to definitely feel a lot warmer, especially with more opportunities of sunshine and less precipitation around.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.